the rancor of the front entrance. It's been very good, but it's great to welcome Nigel here today. Nigel's come in, I think, last Sunday, into Australia and doing a speaking tour all around the country, culminating with CPAC on the weekend, which is going to be extremely solid and not very woke. So let's get to that, which we're looking forward to. Nigel, I just thought, thanks for making the time and coming along. And I just thought it'd be good to just address this in terms of a Q&A sort of format. Are you happy for me to?
Yeah, no, absolutely. This is the first Parliament I've been in since the 31st of January 2020, which was the day we left the European Union, when I got up and waved my Union Jack, and they cut me off the microphone. And I won't tell you what I said next, but I walked out of the building and I've never been back. And we've left, and it's marvellous. But the reception I've got thus far this morning here is much friendlier than I had on any day of my 21 years in Brussels. So thank you for that.
No, it's our pleasure, and great to have you. And you'll be happy to know that DPS told me this morning that the smoking requirement ban has been lifted. So if you want to feel it, so just go your hardest. We were talking about your experience in the European Parliament with.
Yeah, they brought a smoking ban in the European Parliament, and I did what I normally do with rules and just ignored it completely. And I got the second warning letter from the President of the Parliament. Dear Mr. Farage, smoking evidence has been found in your office, and if this happens again, we will fine you €250. So I wrote a lovely letter back and said, dear Mr. President, to save all the paperwork and the time, why don't we just put in a monthly standing order? And I never heard back. Never heard back. We just continued.
People in the room, they're going to be very concerned about giving me those sorts of ideas. So well done. Thank you very much for that. Let's start with a bit of a background. Born in Kent. Do you want to disclose the date? It's not very long ago. So.
1964.
1964.
Yeah. I'm the last year of the boomers. The post
so we'll excuse you from that. You don't qualify. And joined the Conservative Party in 1978.
I did. Yeah. I grew up in the 70s when the UK was in real trouble. Strikes. 26% inflation, bond market in trouble, pound weak. Or was that yesterday? But we were in a terrible state in the 70s. We were the sick man of Europe. We'd never been at a worse point. There's no question. The UK were the losers of World War II. World War II bankrupted Britain. We didn't recover from it at all. The country was in a really bad way. We were living in real socialism. Income tax over £38,000 a year was 83%. Tax on unearned income was as high as 98%. So very high tax, a massive brain drain. Many of our brightest, best young people in the 70s left for Australia, the US. So the country was in a real mess. And oddly, there was a political consensus between left and right that the state was the answer to everything. Most of our industries were privatised. It really was, a socialist state. And along in 1978 came a new political philosophy, which we now know as Thatcherism, right, which was the state doesn't do things very well. We're going to bring down taxes. We're going to take on, and they were communist trade unions with very close links with the Kremlin, many of them. Keith Joseph, who was the intellectual behind Thatcherism, came to my school and spoke. I was 14. I joined the Conservative Party, and I was part of that Thatcher revolution. And it was tough. The lame duck industries were all allowed to close. It was tough for the north of England. But by the end of those 11 years, I think Britain's place on the world stage was completely different to where it had been at the start. And foreign businesses were flooding into London particularly. And I worked in the city of London in those roaring 1980s. It was an amazing place to be and to work. And I worked really hard there up until lunchtime every day. Not much used to happen in the afternoons. The culture was there. So I was very much, I believe in free market capitalism. I believe in giving men and women the opportunity to take risk, to go out, to do their own thing. And if people are incentivized by profit, that shouldn't be a dirty word. Because if they make profits, they employ more people. They employ more people, they pay more taxes. And the more taxes we pay, the more money there is for hospitals, schools, and all the rest of it. And to my absolute dismay, when the left say capitalism is failing, forget it. We've not had capitalism for decades. We're now living in a world of global corporatism, or should I say now global woke corporatism, where big business, big government, big business, big banks all work together. And of course the European Union, which is really the epicenter of the globalist project, that's where big industries now get to set the rules in their own businesses, in their own industries, to make barriers to entry for any competitor literally impossible. And I think this has to be reversed. I think the nation state is the level at which it can be reversed. I think as soon as you go supranational, as soon as you go to the EU, or it could be the UN or whatever it is, as soon as you go supranational, you take away the ability of voters to change the direction of governments. So my political views haven't changed one bit since 1978, and yet I found myself for a number of years being, without doubt, the most demonized post-war British figure. Mosley in the 30s, who led the fascists, had a bit of a tough time with the press. But since 1945, I was the most demonized person for daring to take on what had become a new status quo, the tyranny of the status quo. Funny thing is, my extreme views are now utterly mainstream. We've left the European Union. We have a new Prime Minister who is now beginning to advocate free market economics, beginning to advocate supply-side reform, lifting the burden of bureaucracy off businesses, cutting taxes, giving incentives. So, for me, it was a very long journey. It was 27 years from the first time I stood as a candidate in an election to us leaving the European Union. But you know what? We got there. We got there. And I think Brexit is the first brick out of the globalist wall. There's no way the European Union can survive or stay together. I'm pleased with what we achieved, but at the same time, I'm concerned today about what I see as a complete attack on Western civilization. Whether it's our rights of free speech, whether it's what we teach our kids at school. There's no question there is a Marxist attempt to literally bring down Western civilization. And indeed, Black Lives Matter are a very good example of that. Just read their website. They want to bring down Western civilization. They want an end to the father and mother and what we understand as the normal family. They're looking to completely, just as Lenin sought to do this in Russia, they used class in those days to divide people and make them hate each other, and now they're using race.
Yeah. And of course, it was a journey to Brexit. It didn't just happen overnight, as you said, 27-something years. 2014, I think, in the European elections, UKIP, you're a founding member of UKIP, United Kingdom Independence Party, and you won 24 seats. First time a party other than a mainstream or a major political party had done something like that. And then in 2014, you were awarded the Britain of the Year by The Times. So you really had made a splash at that point. And
I couldn't believe it. That year, The Times ran 20 front pages about me, and not one of them were ones that I would have chosen to be in the public domain. But yeah, so in fact, that was remarkable for them to do that. Yeah. 2014 was remarkable. You see, a lot depends on the electoral system that you live under, and you know this obviously with your two houses. But European elections were on the basis of proportional representation. So when UKIP won that election, it was the first time since 1906 that a party that wasn't Labour or Conservative had won a national election. And then in 2019, when I launched the comeback with the Brexit Party to get rid of Mrs May, which I was particularly proud of, again, we won that election. So I did actually win two national elections leading two different parties. But when it came to first past the post, for the general election, 2015, 4 million votes and 1 seat. So what electoral system you operate under makes a very big difference.
Doesn't it?
It does.
Just on Brexit, because of course I think that's one of the great political stories of its time. You described it as a victory for real people, for ordinary people, and for decent people. So it was originally a fringe movement, really, wasn't it? Back a long time ago. It wasn't early days a populist.
Fringe.
A populist.
Fringe.
Yeah.
I was the fringe of the fringe. I mean, I was the patron saint of lost causes I mean, for almost 20 years.
So what is it? What happened? What happened then that took it from that point to people understanding the agenda?
It was one of those things, you know, I got elected to the European Parliament in 1999, and I realised nobody in the UK knew the name of their MEP. They were completely anonymous. They went to Brussels. They had a fantastic time in Brussels without the glare of the media. All sorts of nonsense used to go on, so I'm told. You get away with murder over there. And of course the money they threw at you. You know, €300 a day pocket money you were given just for turning up. You were given a general expenditure allowance of nearly, well in Aussie, it would be about 8,000 a month. On top of the salary, no need to show any receipts or, no, nothing like that. Chauffeur-driven Mercedes, so you get to the airport or Eurostar, chauffeur-driven Merc would pick you up. I mean, you know, you were treated like as if, you know, you were the sort of new aristocracy in Europe. And it was interesting, there were quite a few people who went there at the same time as me from the Conservative, I was UKIP obviously, but from the Conservative Party who, you know, on day one said, Nigel, we're absolutely with you. We agree with everything you've got to say. And I found within 2 years, they'd had a rather different approach to it all. And I said to one of them, who's now a cabinet minister, so I wouldn't want to embarrass Chris Heaton-Harris at all.
You're outside the jurisdiction.
Well, I said to Heaton-Harris 2 years on, in a bar one evening, and I was probably, to be fair, downwind of a few, and speaking frankly. And I said, what, there's a couple of sort of bleeps in the middle, what happened to you? You know, you were supposed to be a fellow warrior to get us out of this thing. Oh dear boy, he said, I've become more pragmatic. To which I said, well, you mean corrupt, you bastard, don't you? But it's interesting, and I think that happens, to be honest with you, it happens in Washington, and I'm sure it happens in Canberra too. That you go into a very large group of people, elected members, the media around it, the lobby, business, etc. And you know, most human beings do not want to be the exception, do not want to be the odd one out, do not want to be excluded. And I mean, in my case, in Brussels, very few restaurants would serve me, coffee bars wouldn't serve me, pubs wouldn't serve me. I mean, that's the extent to which I was ostracised by that community.
An awful feeling, isn't it?
No, I bloody loved it. but I'm not normal. And I fully accept that. So this is one of the problems, and I think particularly a problem in conservative movements around the Western world, that those conservatives that get elected to parliaments change.
No, we've never had that here ever in the entire history. It has never happened in Canberra ever.
I bet.
Let's pause on that for a minute. 6 years on though, the influence of Brexit now, we're seeing these conservative governments, or depends which newspaper, presumably if you pick up the Times you'll see the words neo-fascist and far right, hard right, and all that sort of stuff.
Almost everyone's far right now.
Of course.
I mean, the Swedish election was won by the far right. The Italian election has been won by everybody's far right.
Which seems to be just, you know, if traditional values and, you know, the nuclear family and that sort of stuff. But clearly it is having a ripple effect through Europe. The movement that you started, the movement that you sort of prosecuted. How do you see it 6 years down the track?
Well, first point to make, I was last here in 2018. And I'd like to have come back sooner, but Australia chose to lock itself away from the rest of the world. I think you guys went through some of the harshest lockdowns anywhere, and you'll be paying the price for that for decades to come. We will too. We will too. The sheer amount of health and psychological harm that has been done to our young people, our old people, is going to far outweigh any potential risk that coronavirus ever presented us with. And I just think we have to resolve to make sure nothing like that is ever allowed to happen again. So monstrous was it. So it's been 4 years since I was last here. When I was here in 18, it was a bit of a victory lap, really, because we'd achieved Brexit, and then the bow wave of Brexit had gone on to the United States of America. and a chap who had no chance, according to the New York Times that morning, it's a 98% certainty that Hillary, the blessed Hillary, would get elected. So we had Trump as well. But I did say to the Australian audiences in 2018 that one of my main motivations for independence from the European Union was I wanted us to re-engage and re-establish with our real friends in the world. And all right, that may not be the case in the middle of an Ashes series, I fully understand that. And Steve Smith did upset us a lot a couple of years ago, but we'll glide over that one. And since that time, the AUKUS deal has been signed. The AUKUS deal, which is very much to Australia's advantage. You've got rid of this ludicrous 1950s French technology on the submarines. You're going to have much better submarines. You can stay submerged for months. The Chinese Communist Party can't see what you're doing. That's one very concrete example of perhaps the relationship between my country and your country being mended. And I say being mended because I genuinely believe that our joining of the common market was a stabbing in the back of our very, very close friends and allies who paid an extraordinary, if England needs a hand, well, here it is, from the Anzac Corps right through World War II. And I think the betrayal of Australia and other countries is an utterly shameful thing to do. But of course, it was what the big corporations wanted, and that's in the end what our politicians did. So I see our relationship with the rest of the world getting much, much better. I think the Anglosphere is very much more important than most people realise. And I just want to say this quickly. Obviously, in between arranging this tour and arriving, we had the death of Queen Elizabeth II. I know that you Australians think that we, particularly the English, are all terribly buttoned up and emotionless. Well, I can tell you, it's been a very emotional few weeks in London. Very, very emotional. I think the number of people that said to me they were shocked at their own response to it. The number of people said they couldn't sleep at night. It was as if just something that had been a central part of our lives had gone. And somebody who represented the most amazing values of honesty, decency, patriotism, Christianity. Yes, we're even talking about Christianity in the wake of the Queen's death. And of course, duty, service, and selflessness. And of course, we've now got King Charles III. And he and I have not always been the best of buddies. Yeah, that's putting it mildly. But he is the king. He's promised that he will not continue with his political campaigns, and I'll take him at his word. We in my country we haven't even rediscovered, we've learned for the first time what a constitutional monarchy actually is, because we've taken it for granted. We've actually seen the magic of monarchy over the last few weeks. I would say that the monarchy right now is in a stronger position than it's ever been. The Queen is united left and right, an apolitical figure who rises above. There are huge advantages to that. Now, there will be, of course, a big constitutional debate here in Australia, although I understand it's going to follow. The first referendum will be on the voice. Exactly how that's going to be defined, I'm not terribly sure. But as I see it, it'll be a referendum on whether one ethnic group in Australia have more rights than other ethnic groups. If you guys think that's going to bring harmony, then I think you're barking up the wrong tree. But I just want to make this plea. It's completely up for you to decide whether it's appropriate in the 21st century for a king living in London to be your head of state. And if you want to get rid of that and replace it with a clapped-out politician under a sort of puritanical system that no one has any respect for at all, that's entirely up to you. And I wouldn't seek to influence you at all on that. But the serious point is this, and please take this on board. Whatever you decide constitutionally for your head of state, please, please think about the Commonwealth. We have undervalued this asset massively, and Australia, frankly, has pretty much ignored it when you could, given the maturity and size and strength of your nation, actually, particularly in this time zone, be playing a bit more of a leading role. And why is that important? Well, in the Anglosphere, we share so much. We share language, We share common law, similar contract law, shared histories. And that's the same for all the little countries as well that are part of the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth, with 2.5 billion people within it, and a common language, and we play sport together and all sorts of things. The Commonwealth, I think, potentially now, is the strongest bulwark we have against Chinese communist imperialism. I think together this could be a very powerful organisation. It wouldn't even have survived without Elizabeth. You know, she spent decades, didn't she, touring, you know, even the little Commonwealth members of 25,000 people, you know, she and Philip went and visited. I now think we need to think very hard about the Commonwealth, and I think Australia actually has a very important role to play here. I really do.
What about, I'm always intrigued by the term populism in politics, you know, because it's given, and I'm sure none of the very important news outlets that are here today, we've got some good friends here, none of them would do this, but it's almost given a pejorative term, yes, populism, when to me it really just means everyday people pushing against the elites. And of course Brexit was termed as a populist movement, like that was some sort of terrible thing. The Trump phenomenon was termed that. Is this just another trick of the fake news?
I remember shortly after the Brexit referendum giving a speech in the European Parliament, and anyone that's followed my speeches there will know I was always very helpful and constructive towards them at every stage of what I did. And I said to them, isn't it funny? Populism is becoming very popular. I mean, anything that is even a mildly conservative view, pejorative terms are attached to it. It's just ridiculous. But you know what? Actually, that's not the fault of the left. That's not the fault of mainstream media. It's the fault of conservative politicians being gutless and spineless. Whenever they face any awkward questions or difficulty, they shy away and back away. And I think the reason this agenda has gone as far as it has is frankly because elected conservatives right across the Western world have been pretty useless.
Yeah. Agree with that. Now let's talk about net zero. We've got an interesting situation here in Australia in the sense that we don't have the ability to generate nuclear power, except, of course, through the bill introduced by Senator Matt Canavan, who's here today, led the charge on a bill to remove that prohibition. Nuclear power in Australia, what are your thoughts?
Well, you've got no uranium, have you, Sam? The whole thing's hopeless. I mean, God, you could be one of the richest countries on the planet. Nuclear is back in a big, big way. I mean, you know, in countries like America, they're now big majorities want a lot more nuclear power. Even we're going for nuclear power because, of course, unlike those wretched, ugly, ghastly wind turbines, you know, nuclear power gives you baseload guaranteed power. And of course, you'd have thought the Greenies would love it because it doesn't produce carbon dioxide. But of course, the truth is they want us to give up eating meat and live in caves. They're not really interested in anything else. Look, you know, for Australia, it's a no-brainer. You know, this really could make you one of the richest per capita countries in the world. There is going to be a massive expansion of nuclear. I mean, even countries like Germany are having a real debate, reconsidering. The French need to upgrade their nuclear industry because it's getting very, very old. Uranium has got a very, very big future. I have no doubt about that. On net zero, I would just say this to you. Of course, you know, we're all concerned about the climate. We're all concerned about the environment. I've been an environmentalist all of my life. All of my life. You know, I'm a hunting, shooting, fishing conservationist who cares about the environment in which we live, and I mean that seriously. As for carbon dioxide, I don't know. It's quite possible. I mean, mankind produces 3% of the carbon dioxide produced every year. It may well be that we're having a huge effect upon the climate in which we live. But please don't call CO2 a pollutant. That is cobblers. You know, we pump CO2 into greenhouses to make tomatoes grow better. You know, a lot of what's said here is nonsense. What I do know is this. In our case, of that 3% that is produced every year by man, we produce just under 1% of it. All right? And for the sake of reducing our carbon emissions, we've deindustrialized. Both our aluminium smelters gone. Most of our refining gone. Most of our chemical industry gone. Most of our heavy engineering gone. Nearly all of our steel production gone. Where's it gone? India and China, where the same products are produced under lower environmental standards and then the goods are shipped back to us. But we've reduced our CO2 output, so we feel very virtuous. Actually, we've increased global CO2. So the first thing you do, if you're going to follow net zero, you deindustrialise. The second thing you do is don't produce your own energy, import it from lovely people around the world, in Saudi Arabia or Russia or wherever else it may be. It is complete and utter madness. We've gone for wind energy in a massive way. We funded it by putting tariffs, 25% tariffs, on the electricity bill of ordinary people and on industries and businesses. And we now face the prospect this February, and literally, our future this winter depends on one factor, the weather. Can you believe it? The weather. If we get a ruddy grey anticyclone sitting over the North Sea in February for a couple of weeks, we'll get low temperatures, zero wind, and the lights will go out. The lights will go out. And it just strikes me that Scott Morrison turned up at COP26, and it's rather like I said earlier, people don't like to be the odd man out. So there he is being bullied by all the other world leaders, and he signs Australia up to net zero without your country having a proper debate on what it is, what the consequences are. And anyway, what's the point? When China built 80 new coal-fired power stations last year, I mean, they are literally laughing at us as we pursue courses that make us dependent upon others for energy and give away our ability to be manufacturing nations. Frankly, the whole thing is crazy. God knows what got into Boris. It must have been that woman, mustn't it? I mean, I can't think what else it is. As soon as Carrie Antoinette appeared on the scene, he just went absolutely crackers. So please, don't do it to yourselves, Australia. And if you do it, at least have a debate about it.
Yeah. The policies, of course, have got a real world effect. We're seeing that in the Netherlands. We're seeing it in Sri Lanka.
Oh, yeah.
Because of the reduction in farming nitrogens and fertilisers.
Yeah.
Messages for Australian farmers to be wary. We've just actually signed a new bill passed a new bill in the last month or so, which ties us to a 43% target. It's coming.
Well, all those beef cattle I saw on the road coming down from Sydney this morning, I mean, you're going to have to kill a lot of those. I mean, and that's what's happening in the Netherlands. They're making their farmers reduce the amount of livestock they've got.
So what's it all about? Where does it come from? What role does the World Economic Forum play in all of this?
Well, I think we can get overexcited about the World Economic Forum in the sense that, when I first got into politics, first elected politics back in the 90s, it was then the Bilderberg Group. Yeah. There have always been these groups of big businesses, big government, who agree on a common agenda. So there's nothing, the WEF hasn't just sort of sprung up from Middle Earth like some new monster. This is the desire of the rich and powerful to control everything. It's always been that. It's always been that.
And you talked a little bit about the need for conservative politics to muscle up. I guess, as we talked about earlier, some of the issues for Conservatives are the fear of being called names. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, I was rudely set upon by one of our senators who called me a racist, I'm told. Now, I'm not a racist, as it turned out, but the ability for the left of politics to use name calling.
Yeah.
I mean, what is it about Conservatives that we need to just muscle up and brush that off? I mean, how has that flowed out?
Well, I'm afraid, this is what happens, isn't it? The chairman of the Sheffield branch of the Conservative Party at 11:30 one night sends out an indiscreet email, and then because of that, the Guardian get on to the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister has to denounce, this half-pissed person from Sheffield at midnight the night before, who was only a volunteer anyway, and has got no influence over the party whatsoever. And the person has to be denounced, cast out, and there has to be a reaffirmation from the Conservative that we are not this, and we're not that, and we're not the other. This is where you cede ground. You keep moving backwards the whole blooming time. All political parties in their volunteer wings have people on the left and right who say completely batty, nutty stuff. I think as far as the insults are concerned, I think we almost, as conservative thinkers and political figures, or in my case now journalists, I think we sort of, I mean, you could have said, no, I'm not a racist, this is terrible, no, just ignore the bastards.
Yeah.
These words mean nothing. Rather like, any other term, populist, racist, just ignore them. Don't give them the time of day, move on. None of this is convincing. None of these insults are convincing decent, ordinary people that live out there in our countries. And I think actually, rather than giving ground away, I think we now need a much more muscular form of conservatism that starts to regain some of this territory.
Right.
And I think it's the extent to which we've been bullied, whether it's on gender issues, trans issues, climate issues. It's about time we actually, as you say, manned up, muscled up, and started to retake some of this ground.
Ooh, I want to ask you a couple more questions that can actually sit there, and then maybe just take a few questions from the crowd. But I'm interested in, as I'm sure many are, in the midterm elections in the US. How you see that playing out, how the MAGA movement, the populist movement, if you like, out there is tracking in the US, and then ultimately what you see for the presidential race.
Well, I mean, clearly, Biden is an absolute joke as president. Incredible, though, isn't it, that Kamala Harris is even more unpopular than Biden. And the only other choices they've got for 2024 are a bloke who was mayor of a town in Indiana that had about 40,000 people in it, or Gavin Newsom from California, a state that has completely failed on health, education, and everything else. By comparison, I think the Republicans are in quite a healthy state. They've got the Donald, who, of course, has 42 to 43% of the electorate that absolutely adore him. It's not enough to win on its own, but adore him. They've got DeSantis. I mean, wow. Wouldn't Victoria State have been better run by Ron DeSantis over the course of the last couple of years? Clearly DeSantis, very talented, very principled, couldn't give a damn, could he, what abuse he gets?
Correct.
Couldn't give a damn, ignores it. Literally ignores it and gets on with the job. Doesn't get distracted by anything or anybody. So I think the Republicans have some real choices to make for 2024. If Trump wants to run, it's his. Is Trump the right person to run in 24? I think he is. Others disagree. Ultimately, you've got to win. John Howard said to me years ago, no conservative leader can win a majority in the Western world without blue-collar support. And hey, he did win a few elections here, didn't he? And it's much the same in America. Who is the candidate most likely to win those votes from Pennsylvania right across the Great Lakes up to and including Wisconsin? Michigan, the ex-steel towns, people like that. I still think Trump has got more ability to win those votes. As for the midterms, I have to say the Republicans are not quite as chirpy as they were a month or two ago. I think that's because Biden has actually managed to get some legislation passed. Massive cash handouts that have been given to the American people, and they wonder why there's inflation, but hey. And also now, relief on student loans, etc. It does appear that the Biden administration getting a few things passed in the last few months has had a bit of an effect. I think it's without doubt that the Republicans will take the House, but obviously it's the Senate that is absolutely key. On balance, I would say we'll come out of the midterms with the Republicans in charge of both. When it comes to the next presidential election, well, we talked earlier, didn't we, about electoral systems. And if you just print tens of millions of ballots and just send them out and allow people to vote without any proof of identity, don't be surprised if you get odd results. Now, I'm not going down the stolen election narrative. All I'm telling you is I've seen the corruption of our voting system in Britain through postal votes. And every year, people go to prison year after year after year for postal vote fraud, and it needs to be cleaned up. I think if the next presidential elections are conducted in a clean, fair way, the way that American elections are normally conducted, I've little doubt there'll be a Republican back in the White House. And I'll just say this. 2016, with Brexit and Trump, was viewed by many as being an aberration, a political aberration, an outpouring of anger was how it was viewed. Actually, far from it being an aberration, I think that populist trend, if we want to call it that, that began, I think it's barely begun. And the reason I believe that is I think the globalist model doesn't work. The big corporate control of a highly regulated world, and all we've seen is the rich getting much, much richer, and everybody else, those in the middle, finding they can't live and can't afford to do the things they could 10 or 20 years before. The remarkable thing about Brexit and Trump in 16 is these two seismic events happened in relatively benign economic circumstances. You normally think of big political change being in recessions, depressions, or whatever, historically. And I have no doubt we are going into very, very tough economic times. Very tough economic times. And that will accelerate that political change. We've seen it. As I say, I mean, Sweden's been run by Social Democrats since 1945. It's not now. Italy has got this new far-right government. And I think the idea, and the Ukraine war has done a fair bit for this, but the idea that the nation state is the unit that actually matters in time of stress, trouble, or danger, and the idea that the nation state actually should, as much as it can be energy independent, be food independent. These are the ideas that will be in the ascendancy over the course of the next few years. So no, I think we're going to see I think we're going to see a very big swing towards conservative movements. I genuinely do.
Just want to finish off with this last question, and we might take a few.
Sure.
The transition now. Now you are now a journalist. You're now a journalist with GB News.
Yep.
And which we'll just like you to tell us a little bit about. But also, can you tell us a little about when Australians think of you? I think they think of you holding one of those you have an imperial pint.
Quite right, too.
Which is a strange concept to us, but you're probably filling it with some Tennent's or Newcastle Brown or something warm. But you now are in the gin business as well.
Yeah, I am. You're right. Look, I was never a politician, and I'm not a journalist either. I'm a campaigner. I'm a campaigner for the things that I believe in. And whether I use elected politics or use 3.3 million followers on social media, I'm into TikTok now. Can you believe it? TikTok. I know it's home for the Chinese. Yeah. I'm having so much fun on TikTok because they're all teenagers, and I'm telling them, don't listen to your school teachers. Ignore them. They're telling you a load of rubbish. So I'm putting out big patriotic messages on TikTok, and it's going quite well. Whether it's through, and GB News was launched because we literally did not have any mainstream television in Britain that had an even vaguely conservative voice, and that's why GB News was launched, and of course headed up by Angelo Frangipoulos, who of course before helped set up Sky News Australia. So GB News is there to give choice. Now, I'm a campaigner. That's what I do. I campaign for change. I like to think that I campaign on issues that are majority issues out where normal people live, but aren't majority issues in our capital cities. And as for the gin business, well, yeah, no, you're quite right. An imperial pint of English beer. I've never been photographed without one in England. This was not some sort of PR publicity stunt, just that's what I do after a day's work. I go for a beer. What's wrong with that? And it suddenly became this big issue. And the Daily Mail were really having a go at me because they thought I damaged the Conservative vote, without realising, of course, that millions of Labour voters, patriotic Labour voters, came in our direction, believing in border controls and things like that. So the Mail used to just, they were paying these freelance photographers 400 or 500 quid, get a picture of Nigel drinking. And it wasn't very hard to do, to be honest. You get 400 or 500 quid. And they kept publishing these, and the message from the Mail and others was, you can't trust this bloke, he's a pisshead, is what they were saying, which is not true. And so we decided then to turn it the other way. Right. And just do press calls, do press conferences in pubs, and of course Joe Public loved it. Yes, Farage Gin has been launched. Unfortunately, not yet available for export to Australia, but we are having a go at that too. So yeah,
that's great. Well, we might just quickly take a few questions, sure. And if it is from the media, just perhaps let us know. Not that I'm sure it'll change the answer, but we might as well know. Keith.
Yeah, thanks very much. Keith Pitt, I'm the federal member for Hinkler up in Bundaberg, Central Queensland.
Yeah, we've got a microphone.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Home of the best gin in the world, under $50. Kalki Moon from Bundaberg, awarded.
I'm in Brisbane tomorrow. I'll try one.
We've seen today reports of potential sabotage on Nord Stream 1 and 2 for gas. What exactly is it you think that the British PM can actually do in England to make sure that you don't black out?
Well, it's a bit late, isn't it, really? There isn't much we can do. I mean, Truss has said that we will start to develop our onshore gas field with reserves estimated between $1 and $2 trillion worth. But, you know, even if we press the button today and get through planning restrictions, etc., it's going to be a year, 18 months. As far as this winter's concerned, we are very, very vulnerable, but maybe not as vulnerable as the Germans are, and the Italians are, and the rest of Europe is. And, you know, we all thought, aren't we wonderful? We're putting these sanctions on Russia. You know, we're being really virtuous. Oh, we've banned Russians from playing at Wimbledon, tennis. Mind you, you put Novak Djokovic in prison, so hey, there you are. And actually what's happening economically is the sanctions are hurting us far more than they're hurting Putin, because he's found new markets in China and India, I'm afraid, to some degree. So yeah, we're in trouble. We're in trouble. Trump, at the UN in 2018, the UN General Assembly, Trump gave a speech and he pointed to the German delegation and said, "You've made yourselves too dependent on Russia," and they all laughed at him. Well, there you are. So the answer is, short term, we're in real trouble. Don't put yourselves into that same peril.
Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Nigel. Dave Gillespie, member for Lyme. Also about the Ukraine situation, and I'd like to commend Britain on its sort of flag-leading support for Ukraine. But a phenomenon that we're all worried about is the madness of Putin. But I'm more worried that there are some people who historically have been on the conservative side of the ledger, but they seem to have gone so far that they're almost running into their lefties and closet and sometimes outwardly supporting a madman. How can you comment or try and explain this weird outcome?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the whole Russia thing is so complicated, isn't it? I mean, the irony of Russia, the irony of Trump, who, you know, if you believe the New York Times, only won the election because of Russia, and yet the truth of it is, it's the Germans who were in bed with Russia, not Trump. So whichever way you cut this Russia argument, you begin to start to go round in circles. Truth of it is, my view very strongly is that the EU and NATO made a big mistake by constant eastward expansion. You know, it gave Putin a casus belli. It gave him an argument to make to the Russian people. Strategically, we should not have done it. And I did say in the European Parliament in 2014 there'd be a war in Ukraine. I said it openly and clearly. Went down well, as you can imagine. Look, nothing, despite our strategic errors, nothing justifies Putin sending the tanks on Kiev. And if the human rights abuses that he claims in the Donbass against the Russian-speaking people have been going on for the last 8 years, why haven't we heard about it earlier? All right? So no, nothing can defend or support Putin's actions. The worry is that he's not well. He's clearly on steroids, just with the change of the shape of his face. It looks like a thyroid problem. There could even be a touch of Parkinson's there too. I don't know. But I'd always thought he was a very sound mind. I mean, not the sort of chap you'd want to take home to meet mum for tea on a Sunday afternoon, but I always thought he was of sound mind. And now there's a question about whether he is. I mean, even at the height of the Cold War, even during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we never saw voices from the Soviet Union threatening to use nuclear weapons. And yet we quite regularly hear that on state TV in Russia and from Putin's speech the other day. How worried should we be? Actually, not as worried as all that, and here's why. During the 50s, as that nuclear escalation built up between the Americans and the Soviets Union very sensibly put in a place to protect itself from a Russian president going mad. Now, there is not a red button on Putin's desk. he can't sort of come in one morning in a bad mood and just press the button. Any order that came from him to use nuclear weapons in any way would need to go through 3 separate decision-making layers. And I think at that point, the military would remove him from office. So I don't think this is going to go in that direction. But my guess is that what will happen in the Donbass will be a standoff, a stalemate that could go on for years to come. That's my guess.
We might take 2 more, one from Matt and then one from Andrew.
Thanks very much, Alex. Thank you, Nigel, and I do want to congratulate you on your Brexit victory. As you said, it was a defeat for the supranationalists. I want to ask you, though, have they now somewhat undermined those gains through the net zero agenda? Because here in this country, one of the big reasons we were told we had to sign up was because if we didn't sign up, Europe would tariff our exports, we wouldn't be financed international markets. Is that playing out in your view? And if so, how do we fight back? How do we remove that agenda so that we can re-establish national sovereignty?
Look, I think the whole net zero thing is actually going to come crashing down. I think there's going to be a massive pendulum swing back in politics because, frankly, if I'm half right about just how miserable this is going to be in Europe. Do you know, today the German Green Party are saying to people, don't have Christmas lights this year. In public buildings in Cologne, council housing in Cologne, they're rationed to 1 hour of hot water every day. I mean, people's living standards are collapsing as a result of this. There is no way politically the net zero agenda in the West can hold. It won't. And Australia should not allow itself to be threatened and bullied by people in that way. It's quite interesting, actually, in life. When you stand up to bullies, they tend to back away. Yeah. All right? And maybe that's what Scott Morrison should have done at COP26, but he chose not to do so. All right?
We're going to have one more question from Andrew.
Yes.
Afternoon, Nigel. Andrew Hastie from Western Australia. I'm a lower house member with the Liberal Party. I'm asking a question as a campaigner. You mentioned that Conservatives need to work with blue-collar workers
yes.
to win government in the future. This is a question about the Labor movement, not just here, but also in the UK, and also the centre-left movement in the United States.
Yeah.
Who's going to be their base in the future as they become increasingly post-industrialist, post-materialist, and more progressive? If we need blue-collar workers to form government, who do they need to form government?
Oh, that's very easy. That's very easy. White, well-off, privileged, university educated, no doubt with degrees in social sciences that are completely and utterly useless in the real world, living in lovely houses, and they live in Alexandria, just outside Washington, D.C. Yeah. They live in Kingston, in southwest London. Families that normally would have been Conservative voters because they were middle class and well off, and who now take a different worldview. And in a sense, isn't that what you saw here in Australia with the Teals? Isn't it exactly the same phenomenon that I'm talking about in Washington, D.C. and in London with the Teals? And I suggest to you that the big challenge for your party going ahead from here is to work out what it really is. And opposition's a very useful time to do that. But if the Liberal Party decides that what it's got to do is get back that vote from the Teals, become sort of Labour light in some way, become very much more committed to net zero and all the rest of it. I mean, I think if you do that, you'll lose next time by an even bigger margin. The left and right of politics, the class structure of the left-right vote of politics has changed. Those Teal voters have gone. They're not coming back. And it's the same in my country, and it's the same in the States. And they are the big class shifts that are going on between left and right politics. And it's the same phenomenon in every English-speaking country.
Well, Nigel, thank you.
Thank
you for coming and visiting us here and for all the work you've done over the course of your career and now into the journalist space, I suppose, but also for giving Conservatives something to aim at. I think, I personally, from where I sit, people like yourself and others, Ron DeSantis, people who have led the charge without fear or favour and spoken have been a great, I suppose, emblematic of what needs to be done. So it is absolutely true what you say. We need to be strong, courageous, and we're going to push through. So thank you for leading that charge over the course of your time. We look forward to seeing you more on GB News and in the tour coming up, and we'll see you at CPAC on the weekend.
Absolutely. Well,
So
thank you.
Thank you very much for coming.
Indeed.
Thanks, Nigel. Good to see you. Now, we're going to. Excellent. Thank you. We're going to go next door.